I would not refer to them as necessarily progressive presidents, even though arguably they were in some ways. Uh, Primarily because one of them is actually going to run for president after he had already been president for a third party, which is officially called the Bull Moose Party, but is known as the Progressive Party. There have been a few parties, at least two, known as the Progressive Party. One in the Progressive era, that situation, and one in the 1940s. Uh, so actually, that guy who ran for the Bull Moose Party, first president on the list, also the youngest president, youngest person to be sworn in as president ever, not Kennedy, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. He becomes president in 1901 after William McKinley, the president, is assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt's vice president. So at the age of 42 and some odd days, he is sworn in as president. Kennedy, I believe, is the oldest, youngest person elected to be president, elected by only about 120,000 votes. Mostly dead people in Chicago. Just kidding. Not really. I'm just kidding. Theodore Roosevelt, depicted here on the top right. Actually, he's depicted in the middle too, but focus on the top right. 2 terms as president, known as the Trust Buster. Right? There is a political cartoon. Political cartoons in the late 19th, early 20th century are great. They still are, they still are, but just really interesting to look at. This is a picture of him wrestling the railroad industry, right? He's wrestling some guy who has the head of a railroad. Railroads, the first big American corporations. He's going to establish the agency that regulates the railroads. He's going to, in his first, what you call a trust bust, basically taking the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and enforcing it, using it to go after companies, to break up monopolies, to create competition, right? Without competition, there's no checks on prices. There's no checks on how much people are getting paid to do the work. There's no checks on how much you're charging for the product. No checks on whether or not the product's any good, right? A good example I feel in our own time is a utilities company, PG&E. If you rent, if you lease, if you own a home in this area, you have to go to PG&E to get gas and electricity. So I mean, they can do not that great of a job. They can jack up the rates. There's some consumer protection in the government, but really without another company out there willing to provide, the same service for less, or without that sort of competition. I mean, they kind of blew up San Bruno, the whole town. Anyways, I digress. There's Teddy Roosevelt wrestling the railroad industry to the ground. In his first trust bust, he breaks up a company established by none other than financier J.P. Morgan, right? So very bold guy, very complicated in so many ways. Very progressive in domestic policy, with the trust busting with the national parks, expanding on the national park system first established by Lincoln, which it really does fit into this concept of regulating, curbing the excesses of capitalism, right? Recognizing that if we don't explicitly state these lands, Yosemite, Yellowstone, etc., must remain preserved and untouched, corporate interests might, the greed, the desire for resources, the desire for wealth will cloud their judgment of the common good. And eventually those lands will be gone. At least they won't be pristine. So we need the public needs to step in and set aside those lands as off limits, right? Of course, that creates another problem because there are areas with indigenous communities that fish and hunt and lived in places for centuries and centuries. And now because of corporations, we're telling everybody that they can't do certain things here and there. And anyways, the national park system, which is referred to as America's best idea, right? Taking the most beautiful landscapes we have and maintaining them for public viewing, not for the wealthy, but for the public. He's going to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Foreign policy wise, he's kind of what you would call a jingoist or a saber rattler. He used to say, "Speak softly or carry a big stick." He forces Cuba to sign the Platt Amendment in a lot of in so many words, which I'm sorry, the Platt Amendment. I'm sorry, that occurs under McKinley. But similar to that, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically takes the Monroe Doctrine that says, in sort of generic terms, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas are a family. The United States is the patriarch. Europe, don't try to colonize stuff over here, right? Basically takes that and says we actually have the right to intervene militarily in any Latin American country, in any country in the Americas, if we see it fit for our national security. For our national security is usually code a lot of the time, for whenever we feel like it. I almost said the F word there. I apologize. But does win a Nobel Peace Prize for the Treaty of Portsmouth, which brokers the Russo-Japanese War, a war between Japan and Russia, a war which Japan wins in 1905, which is a big deal because it's an Asian country, a non-white country defeating a European white country. Russia, which is Eurasia, but still seen as a big deal by the white folks. Japan's coming up, hint hint, foreshadowing, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines. Anyways, yeah, that's Teddy Roosevelt. Brown belt in judo. Good relationship, somewhat good relationship with Japan. Japan gets the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. They don't get the exclusion of immigration. They get some sort of like quota regulatory system hashed out between Roosevelt and the Japanese. Probably because he was such a huge fan of judo. He had Japanese judo guys who would come to the White House and they would move around tables and chairs and for open space and wrestle or grapple. Similarly, actually, this is the same time that the Japanese are establishing a trade in Brazil and teaching the Gracie family there jiu-jitsu, which gives us Gracie jiu-jitsu and ultimately the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Woohoo! Teddy Roosevelt's handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, who was his secretary of, I'm slipping on it. He wasn't his vice president. Was he secretary of the? We'll skip that. But here's basically the other magazine, not McClure's, Puck, depicting Roosevelt leaving the White House to Taft, who's gonna just continue the same policies. This baby is the policies, right? And he does actually. He's a trust buster. He's actually a more aggressive trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt. Not as iconic, not as I don't want to say glamorous or sexy, or not as much of a charismatic figure or a powerful figure. Teddy Roosevelt's really, in many ways, the first modern president, the first president of a nation state, the United States. He's this, so much different from, and a lot of it has to do with the transportation, communication, the ability to go around. But Taft, not as exciting, I guess. I'm not sure, maybe because he wasn't as energetic, probably because he weighed over 300 pounds. He's the heaviest president we've ever had. He had to have a special tub in the White House. He's also the first president to ever throw out the first pitch at a baseball game, the old Washington Senators team. And I believe in that game, too, when he throws out the first pitch, he actually, that's where the seventh inning stretch is rumored to have come from, because he gets up at some point in the game, like the seventh inning, gets up and leaves because he's president. He's got things to do. And everybody sort of stands up, like, oh, the president's standing, let's all stand. And it becomes a seventh inning stretch. That's mythology, who knows? But he goes after Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which apparently he did so much trust busting that he actually upset Teddy Roosevelt, that he was going after too many companies, to the point where Teddy Roosevelt runs against him in 1912 and splits the Republican vote. Debs has 1 million votes from the socialists, but the Republican vote is split, thereby opening the window for the election of our third progressive president, Mr. Woodrow Wilson, the only Democrat other than Grover Cleveland to become president since 1856 to win an election. And he does that because the Republican vote is split. Bear in mind, this has happened since then, too. Bill Clinton likely would not have become president if Ross Perot had not split the more fiscally conservative vote from the Republican nominee George Bush, the Republican incumbent George H.W. Bush. Harry Truman in 1948 runs against 2 breakoffs from his own party, still wins, because that's Harry Truman, and he's special. So Woodrow Wilson, but some sort of at the end of Taft's administration into Woodrow Wilson's administration, you have the 16th and 17th Amendments, which are ratified. right, which created the income tax, and direct election of U.S. senators. Remember, both populists, both parts of the Omaha platform: graduated income tax, direct election of U.S. senators. Radical populists in 1892 say they want that, and they are now constitutional amendments. And remember, 16th and 17th Amendments. So these are the first amendments in almost 50 years since the Civil War Reconstruction era. And those amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, were the first in 50 years, right? So this is only the first few amendments since the founders were still alive, Jefferson and Adams and all those guys. So pretty wild stuff. There are some other amendments passed that are important at the end of the Wilson administration, but that takes place after this little thing called the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I. So we'll talk about those later. But we do also have the establishment under Wilson of the Federal Reserve. There's laws for the 8-hour day. There's laws against child labor. He's also a racist. He is he's from Virginia. He, I believe, roomed in college. He went to Princeton. He has a PhD. He was the president of Princeton University. He was the governor of New Jersey, but he's from Virginia. Went to Virginia Law School. Very educated guy, probably one of our most educated presidents, actually. He has a bachelor's in history from Princeton. Princeton, yeah. He has a law degree from the University of Virginia. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Whew, pretty awesome, but also a total racist. Roomed with Thomas Dixon, the author of The Klansman, the book that inspired Birth of a Nation, the 1915 film, which is going to show at the White House, which Wilson is going to praise, and a film that's going to be very much responsible for the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the teens and 20s. He also resegregates federal employment, like in a really weird way, like clerical workers, people at desks, and they're putting up screens in between white and black workers in a really awkward way, right? Because DC was in the South, right? There were slaves in DC into the Civil War, but yeah. So when it comes to the civil rights issue, not something that we're really going to see as far as public policy addressing what's going on in the South, or even addressing what's going on in the federal government with Wilson. But there are some moments like Teddy Roosevelt having dinner on a regular basis with Booker T. Washington, right? Who was a leader, sort of a figure of the South, with his Tuskegee Institute, that whole thing. Of course, that sort of relationship they had is going to be interrupted due to what's called the Brownsville incident. Basically, some black soldiers in a southern town, some bogus accusations of illegality on their part or something, and it creates some sort of race riot, and it's going to cause tension and blah blah blah. Race riot prior to 1965, the Watts riot, the Watts uprising. Prior to that, if I say race riot, it means whites attacking blacks, whites going into black neighborhoods and attacking them. That's not an original. My dad actually gave me that one several years ago. He's the one that pointed that out to me first. So thanks, Dad. Anyways, so that's the progressive era, at least as far as we're going to cover it. There's so much more in this ins and outs. Jane Addams, the governors of certain states. California is going to get some interesting, stuff. All the propositions we have to vote for every election come from this time period. That's kind of aggravating. Anyways, so Wilson becomes president. He gets reelected in 1916. His campaign slogan is "He kept us out of war," because war breaks out in Europe in 1914. Of course, there are going to be certain things that are going to draw America. I'm doing air quotations. Draw America into war. It's going to be a very controversial war, much more controversial than the Second World War, and we'll talk about that next time, or in class probably. And you're listening to this right now.